He vanished without a trace. No mansion, no cameras, no name anyone would recognize. Just a quiet man in a creaky house with a secret too big for a small street. Why would Keanu Reeves hide among strangers? And what was he really doing behind that backyard fence every Sunday? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Keanu Reeves sat alone in the back of his trailer, the sound of the final scene's applause still echoing in his ears. The director had just called cut on his latest film, a grueling, emotionally heavy project that had pushed him to his physical and mental limits. The crew was celebrating outside. People were taking selfies. Assistants were already talking about press tours, red carpet premieres, and interviews, but Keanu couldn't hear any of it. All he heard was silence pressing against his chest, a silence he had been craving for months. He stared at his hands, still trembling slightly from the intensity of the scene. Somewhere between take 22 and the final shot, he had stopped pretending and started feeling again. Not the character's emotions, but his own. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it came from something deeper, a kind of spiritual fatigue. For years, he had given everything to his work, every film, every appearance, every fan interaction. People adored him. They called him humble, generous, noble. But somewhere along the way, the line between the man and the myth had disappeared. He wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was the 10th time a stranger broke down crying just from meeting him. Maybe it was when even his kindness started trending on social media. He had become a symbol, a story people told about goodness and grace. But in becoming that symbol, he had lost something human. He had lost the ability to just be. That night, Keanu drove back to his house in the Hollywood Hills and didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark for hours, staring out at the city skyline. The house was beautiful. Glass walls, sleek furniture, every amenity money could buy, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Cold, perfect, untouched. His team had offered to arrange a retreat, a private island, maybe the Alps, or somewhere remote with luxury and silence, but that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't need quiet. He needed real. Not escape, but return. Return to something simpler, something small, something human. By the time the sun rose, he had made his decision. The very next day, without telling anyone, Keanu drove to a nearby suburb just outside Los Angeles. A place with old trees, kids on bikes, barking dogs, and neighbors who waved at each other across fences. He parked outside a small, single-story home with peeling paint and a for rent sign posted crookedly in the window. He stared at it for a long time. It was nothing like the houses he owned. But that was the point. It didn't look like somewhere a celebrity would live. It looked like somewhere a man could be forgotten. He called the number and asked if the property was still available. The voice on the other end said yes, surprised someone was interested in such a modest place. Keanu said his name was Kevin Reed. He explained he was a freelance writer looking for a quiet place to finish a personal project. No pets, no guests, no parties. He paid 3 months' rent in advance using an account registered under a different LLC, one of several he had created years ago for privacy. He told no one, not his agent, not his publicist, not even his closest friends. The lease was signed that same afternoon. Keanu arrived in the neighborhood wearing a faded flannel shirt, a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and scuffed boots. He carried only 2 bags, one with clothes and one with books and notebooks. Everything else he left behind. The luxury, the history, the weight. The house was nothing special. The front yard was patchy and uneven. The porch had a loose board that creaked every time he stepped on it. The paint on the windowsills was peeling, and the mailbox leaned slightly to the left, like it had given up trying to stand straight. But inside, the space was clean and quiet. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a narrow living room with secondhand furniture, and a backyard surrounded by an old wooden fence. To Keanu, it was perfect. He made no calls. No internet was installed. The only connection he kept was a prepaid cell phone with no stored contacts and no GPS enabled. He bought groceries in cash, drove a second-hand sedan that he'd purchased anonymously through a broker. At night, he would sit at the small dining table by the window and stare out at the quiet street. The sound of sprinklers, dogs barking, kids playing, those became the music of his new life. He chose the name Kevin Reed because it felt invisible, not too common, not too rare. Just a name that blended in, a name no one would question. He introduced himself to the landlord as a quiet writer working on a memoir. He claimed he had moved from out of state and didn't like the big city. People nodded politely when he said it. No one probed deeper, and that's exactly what he needed. The first few days were strange. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. He walked down the block and passed by neighbors mowing lawns and teenagers on skateboards. No one stared. No one asked for photos. No one whispered his name behind his back. He was just Kevin, the guy who waved in the mornings and kept to himself. The freedom in that was startling. He could breathe. For the first time in years, Keanu felt weightless. Not from lack of responsibility, but from the absence of eyes. The pressure to perform, to please, to live up to the world's expectations. It was gone. In its place was a gentle emptiness, like freshly tilled soil waiting for something to grow. He began spending more time outside, sweeping the porch, watering the brittle plants left behind by the previous tenant, fixing the creaky steps. There was no team of assistants, no stylists, no bodyguards. Just a man in his 50s, trying to make a rented house feel like a home. He was no longer Keanu Reeves, the icon. He was Kevin Reed, the quiet guy who nodded at passing cars and helped carry groceries for a stranger at the corner store. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt exactly right. Each morning began the same. Keanu, now Kevin, would brew a small pot of coffee, open the front door, and step onto the creaky porch with a book in hand. The street was quiet in those early hours. Children hadn't yet left for school. The world still felt drowsy, as if it hadn't quite remembered all the things it had to be yet. He liked that moment. It reminded him that life didn't have to be loud to be meaningful. Neighbors began to notice him, but only in the way one notices a quiet bird that perches near the same tree each morning. A few offered waves. 1 or 2 gave friendly nods. No one asked questions. He was just part of the scenery. That anonymity gave him space to watch, to listen, and to learn. A woman across the street, maybe in her 70s, took her trash out every Wednesday at the same time. She struggled with the bin, and Kevin once stepped in to help. She smiled, said her name was Joyce Donnelly, asked what he did for work. He stuck to his story. Freelance writer. Her eyes lit up. Hope it's something hopeful, she said. We need more of that these days. Another neighbor, a man named Mateo, lived 2 doors down with 2 young kids and a night shift job. Keanu noticed the bags under his eyes, the worn-out shoes, the way he always looked over his shoulder like life might yank the ground out from under him. Keanu didn't ask questions, but he made a mental note. That's what this whole new life was about. Not avoiding people, but seeing them, really seeing them. There was something sacred about being unknown. It allowed Keanu to pay attention without distraction, without the layers of expectation that always came with his name and face. He could walk to the corner store and hear how the cashier joked with the customers. He could sit at the small park bench and hear kids argue about whose turn it was. He could notice when someone's car hadn't moved for days, or when a window stayed dark night after night. He wrote notes about these things in a small journal he kept in his back pocket. Observations, moments, little fragments of humanity. He didn't know yet what he would do with them, only that they mattered. That being present, not as a celebrity, but as a man, was its own kind of service. The silence that had once felt suffocating in his mansion now felt peaceful in this house. Here he wasn't expected to inspire or to perform. Here he could rebuild something inside himself, something that had long been buried beneath headlines and handshakes. And so, without cameras, applause, or anyone watching, Keanu Reeves disappeared into the life of Kevin Reed. And no one noticed. But that was exactly the point. Kevin Reed's first full week on Willow Lane unfolded quietly, just the way he'd hoped. The street was unremarkable, a place where life moved at the pace of dogs being walked and sprinklers ticking away at sunrise. The house he now called home didn't stand out. Its roof sagged slightly on one side. The lawn was mostly weeds. The wooden mailbox looked like it had survived one too many storms. Still, it was alive. It breathed something that his old homes never could: humility. Each morning, Kevin stepped out just after 7 with a cup of coffee and a paperback tucked under his arm. He'd sit on the porch and listen. The garbage truck rumbled by around 8. A kid 2 houses down rode his scooter to school every day, his backpack bouncing. A retired man named Mr. Alston walked his terrier, always muttering to himself about potholes the city hadn't fixed. Life happened without fanfare, and Kevin watched it all unfold from the background. Joyce Donnelly was the first to officially welcome him. She lived next door, in a small blue house with white shutters and a row of rose bushes she tended with more devotion than most people gave their children. She had white hair tied in a low bun and walked with a slight lean to the left, the result of a hip surgery she never stopped mentioning. One morning she appeared at the edge of his yard, clutching a foil-wrapped plate. "Figured you might be hungry," she said, smiling. "I always make too much banana bread." Kevin stood, surprised. "That's very kind. I'm Kevin," he said softly. "Joyce. I live right over here. Been on this street 30 years. I know every crack in the sidewalk." She handed him the plate and looked at him a little longer than most strangers might. He held her gaze without flinching. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Just moved in. Needed a change of pace. I'm a writer, freelance mostly." That answer always worked. It explained his odd hours, his quietness, and the notebook he always carried. "Writer, huh? You one of those mystery guys or romance types?" she teased. Kevin smiled. "Bit of both, I guess." She laughed, clearly enjoying the banter. "Well, Kevin, if you ever want a taste tester for your banana bread, I'm right next door. Don't be a stranger." He thanked her again and watched as she walked back to her house, humming a tune that reminded him of his childhood. Something about her presence felt grounding. She was sharp, observant, but warm. And though she had no idea who he really was, he sensed she was someone who could see beyond surfaces. He wrote her name down that night in his journal, not as a character, but as a marker, a beginning. Kevin quickly settled into the rhythm of the neighborhood. Every morning he'd visit the local corner store, a family-run place called Hillman's Market. It was just a 10-minute walk down Willow Lane, past a row of modest homes with wind chimes and plastic flamingos in the front yards. He always brought a reusable canvas bag and stuck to simple items: milk, coffee, bread, fruit. The cashier, a soft-spoken woman named Carmen, greeted him like any other customer. He liked that. There was no recognition in her eyes, no whispers behind the counter. To her, he was just Kevin. And to him, that was everything. He always paid in cash, always smiled, always held the door for whoever walked in after him. And when he left, he took the long way back, often detouring through nearby side streets, observing people's lives unfold. A mother wrangling 3 kids outside a duplex, a teenager sitting on a stoop, head down, earbuds in, eyes lost, a man sweeping his driveway with practiced care. These weren't moments people wrote about, but Kevin did. Quietly, in his journal, In the evenings, he'd walk the neighborhood with his hood up, not because he feared being recognized, but because the anonymity gave him peace. He passed by homes with the smell of dinner wafting out of screen doors. Dogs barked behind fences. Wind rustled through trees. The neighborhood was alive with simplicity. One night, as he returned from his walk, he noticed Joyce struggling to drag a large bag of garden mulch from her car. She grunted and paused halfway up her walkway, clearly frustrated. Without a word, Kevin jogged over. "Let me get that for you," he said gently. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's heavier than it looks." He smiled. "I've lifted worse." Joyce chuckled. "All right then, Mr. Writer." He carried the bag to her backyard, where a neat garden bed waited beneath a wooden trellis. Rose bushes bloomed in organized rows, and wind chimes clinked gently in the breeze. "I try to keep them going," she said, following behind. "They remind me of my husband. He planted the first one." Kevin placed the bag down with care. "They're beautiful." She nodded, suddenly quiet. "Some days. They're the only ones who still talk to me." He didn't respond with platitudes. He just stood beside her for a moment, letting the silence speak where words couldn't. Then he nodded once and walked back to his yard. From that evening forward, Joyce always waved when she saw him. Sometimes she brought leftover soup or fresh tomatoes from her garden. Other times she simply sat on her own porch and waved across the fence. There was an unspoken agreement between them. Companionship without intrusion. Kevin continued to blend in. Old boots, faded jeans. The quiet rhythm of someone who didn't need to be noticed. No one asked for photos. No one Googled his face. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The old pickup truck came a week later. A dusty, dark green Ford with a dented bumper and cracked leather seats. Keanu had bought it through a private seller 3 towns over, using a friend's alias and cash. It drove rough and smelled like engine oil, but it fit the image perfectly. When Kevin Reed pulled into his driveway now, no one glanced twice. Joyce took notice of the truck the first time she saw it. She waved him over as he stepped out. "The thing's got character," she said with a grin. He nodded. "Yeah, I think it's older than me." "Everything worth keeping usually is," she replied. She offered him a glass of lemonade and they sat together under the shadow of her porch awning. The conversation was light. Gardening tips, how hot the summer had been, which neighbors kept forgetting to bring in their trash bins. But every so often, Joyce would study his face as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "You're not like the others," she said once, casually. "There's something different about you." He smiled softly. "Good different or strange different?" "Just quiet," she said, "but not the lonely kind. The kind that watches." He didn't deny it. Instead, he picked up a fallen leaf from the porch and turned it between his fingers. "I think people miss a lot when they stop watching," he said. Joyce looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Maybe you're just what this street needs." Across the days that followed, Kevin's presence became part of the neighborhood's normal. He waved at children heading off to school, nodded to joggers on their morning runs, and helped Mr. Alston rehang a crooked gutter that had been sagging for years. He did everything without fanfare, never staying long, never talking too much. Just enough to be remembered fondly, but not remembered too clearly. He learned people's names: Carmen at Hillman's Market, Mateo, the tired father with the quiet eyes, Sylvia, who lived 2 blocks over and played the clarinet every Saturday morning with her window wide open. He listened, not just with his ears, but with the kind of presence that made people feel seen without having to perform. There was one evening just before sunset when Joyce saw him sitting on his porch with a candle flickering beside a notebook. She watched from her window for a while before stepping outside. She didn't say anything, didn't wave. She just stood there, hand on her hip, and took in the quiet image of her mysterious neighbor writing in the golden light. She didn't know yet who he truly was, But somehow, deep in her bones, she sensed that this man, Kevin Reed, had arrived on Willow Lane for more than just solitude. He had come here for a reason. She just didn't know what it was yet. The deeper Kevin settled into life on Willow Lane, the more he began to see what most people overlooked. It wasn't the loud moments that caught his attention. It was the quiet ones. The shuttered house at the end of the block, with a wilted wreath still hanging from Christmas. The rusted tricycle left on a porch that hadn't been swept in weeks. A young girl walking her brother to school barefoot, their shoes tied together and slung over her shoulder. Kevin saw these things not with judgment, but with recognition. These were signs of life lived at the edge, where bills came before birthdays and where silence covered the sound of strain. No one waved flags for their hardships, they just kept going. And that quiet endurance moved him more than any award ever had. He started with a woman down the road, Mrs. Chang. She lived in a narrow gray house with a cracked walkway and a wind chime that never stopped tinkling. Kevin noticed she walked with a stiff limp and always leaned heavily on her cane when she returned from the market. One afternoon, he offered to carry her bags. She hesitated, then nodded. "Kevin, right?" she said softly. "Yes, ma'am. Just down the street." "You're polite. Not many people your age still say ma'am." He smiled. "I was raised by strong women." Mrs. Chang's eyes lit up at that. "Then they did well?" From then on, he made a habit of walking to Hillman's Market around the same time she did. He'd carry her bags back without needing to ask. She never explained what caused the limp. He never asked. But he learned that she had 2 sons who lived out of state and called only on holidays. She missed them, but she never said so out loud. Kevin could see it in the way she lingered by his fence after they returned, just long enough to hear one more voice. A few houses down, Mateo was always coming and going. Kevin noticed the man's schedule before he even spoke a word to him. He left before sunrise and didn't return until after dark. His 2 kids, a boy and a girl, waited on the porch every evening, sometimes with their backpacks still on. They'd jump up the moment they heard the rattle of his old Honda turning the corner. One night, Kevin saw Mateo struggling to bring in 2 bags of groceries while trying to unlock the front door, both kids clinging to his legs. Kevin walked over and offered to help. Mateo hesitated, looking him over carefully, then gave a tired nod. "Thanks, man," he said. Kevin carried the bags inside and set them on the kitchen counter. The house was small, but clean. On the fridge were school drawings, gold star stickers, and a torn electricity bill pinned beneath a magnet. "Long day?" Kevin asked casually. "Always," Mateo replied. 2 jobs. Not enough hours, but I got him fed." Kevin nodded. "You're doing more than most." That night, he added Mateo's name to his journal, not as a project, but as a reminder of what resilience really looked like. The more Kevin walked the neighborhood, the more stories he silently collected. Some came from brief exchanges, others came from observation. On the corner of Willow and 8th, there was a duplex with faded yellow siding. A teenage boy sat on the front steps every day after school, staring at his phone. His name was Darius. Kevin had passed him enough times to recognize the slump in his shoulders. One afternoon, he paused and asked how the boy was doing. Darius shrugged. "Just. Waiting for my mom to get off work?" "You wait out here a lot," Kevin said, not unkindly. "She works 2 jobs. I like to see her coming up the block." Kevin nodded. "I get that." They didn't talk much after that. But the next time Kevin walked by, Darius looked up and gave a small nod. It was enough. A few blocks over, a man named Mr. Alvarez ran a mobile repair service out of his garage. Kevin watched him every Saturday morning, tinkering with busted lawnmowers and weed trimmers that neighbors brought over. One day, he walked up and asked about an old electric trimmer he'd found in his shed. "Bring it over," Mr. Alvarez said without hesitation. "I'll take a look." They talked while he worked, mostly about tools, growing up in California, and the best spots in town for tamales. Mr. Alvarez didn't speak much about himself, but Kevin could tell he carried weight in his silence. A picture of a young woman hung inside the garage, taped to the wall just above the workbench. Her smile was vibrant, but her eyes told another story. Kevin didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to. The way Mr. Alvarez occasionally glanced up at the photo as he worked said enough. As the days passed, Kevin began to notice patterns. Windows that stayed dark, mailboxes that overflowed, porches that went untouched. These weren't just neglected homes. They were signs of people who had slowly withdrawn from the world. Whether out of grief, illness, or defeat, they had faded into the background. One of those homes belonged to a man named Walter, who walked with a cane and carried a large manila envelope everywhere he went. Kevin often saw him trudging to the corner pharmacy, moving slow, stopping every half block to catch his breath. One morning, Kevin offered him a ride. Walter declined, but thanked him for asking. "You're new here," he said between gasps, "but you see things, that's rare." Kevin just smiled. "Sometimes noticing is the first step," Walter grunted. "Then maybe you're in the right place." That evening, Kevin sat on his porch with his journal and began writing down not just names but connections. Who talked to whom, who waved, who stayed silent. It wasn't for a project or a role, it was for something else, something he couldn't yet name. He didn't want to fix anyone. He just wanted to understand. And that, he knew, required more listening than speaking. Kevin continued mapping the rhythms of Willow Lane with the care of someone planting seeds he might never see bloom. His notebook was filling with scribbles, names, notes, patterns, not to expose, not to change, but to remember, to witness. He didn't want to be another neighbor who looked away when things got hard. He wanted to be present when presence mattered most. There was a woman he noticed only in glimpses. She lived 2 streets over, always wearing a burgundy cardigan, always clutching a small child to her chest. Kevin saw her early in the mornings, walking slowly to the laundromat, balancing a duffel bag over one shoulder and guiding the child with her other hand. Her name was Alicia. He learned it when the boy ran ahead one morning and tripped on the uneven sidewalk. Kevin had rushed over instinctively, helping the child up and brushing off the gravel from his knees. Alicia had thanked him quietly, eyes wary but grateful. She didn't offer more than her name. Kevin didn't press. There were so many Alicias in this neighborhood, people doing the best they could with almost nothing, people who had no time for pity and no interest in charity. What they craved was dignity, and Kevin could feel that in every passing glance. One afternoon, Joyce stopped him as he was carrying a small box of canned goods from his truck. "You sure do keep busy for someone who's supposed to be writing," she said, half teasing. He chuckled. "I guess I'm just gathering material." She looked at him carefully. "You watch people, not in a creepy way, just different, like you're searching for something." Kevin paused, meeting her eyes. "Maybe I'm just trying to see what most people miss." Joyce softened. "Well, if you're looking for stories, you're in the right place. We've got more heartbreak and grace on this block than you'd believe." He knew that already. He had seen it in Mateo's slouched shoulders as he dragged himself home after double shifts, in Mrs. Chang's eyes as she stood too long on her porch, waiting for a phone call that never came, in Darius's restless fidgeting, in Alicia's silence. He had learned long ago that pain rarely announces itself with volume. It whispers, and if you aren't still enough to hear it, you miss everything. So Kevin kept listening. He gave time where others offered advice. He gave attention where others gave distance. He kept a simple routine, morning walks, small talks, unhurried kindness. No one suspected that the man who walked past their fences every day was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. They just saw Kevin Reed, the quiet man who waved, helped when asked, and paid attention to the cracks in the sidewalk. And slowly, quietly, the neighborhood began to let him in. The idea came to Kevin one quiet Saturday night, as he sat on his porch with a warm cup of tea and the sound of wind rustling through the fence slats. The backyard was plain, just a patch of overgrown grass, an old oak tree, and a narrow stone path that led nowhere in particular. But it had something the rest of the world didn't have: peace. And for the people he'd met, people carrying heavy burdens with quiet strength, peace was in short supply. He woke early the next morning just as the sun began to rise. The air was still cool, and the streets were empty. He pulled a few folding chairs from the garage, brushed off the dust, and set them up in a loose circle beneath the tree. Then he brought out a small table, placed a carafe of coffee and a plate of store-bought pastries on it, and waited. Joyce was the first to appear, of course. She peeked over the fence, curious, wearing her wide-brimmed garden hat and carrying a container of homemade scones. "You having a party I didn't know about?" she asked. "Not a party," Kevin said. "Just coffee. You're welcome to join." She didn't hesitate. "Well, in that case, I'll bring the good jam." 10 minutes later, Mateo walked by on his way to the store and stopped when he saw them. He looked tired but curious. Kevin waved him over. "There's coffee." Mateo hesitated, then stepped through the open gate. "I've got 20 minutes. That first gathering was small, just the three of them, sitting under the tree with the morning sun casting long shadows across the grass. They didn't talk about anything profound, just shared stories. Joyce talked about her roses. Mateo mentioned how his daughter had lost a tooth. Kevin asked questions and listened. That was all. By the end of the hour, Joyce leaned back in her chair and said, "Feels good just to sit and not worry." Kevin nodded. "That's the idea." The next Sunday, Joyce brought her neighbor Sylvia, the one who played clarinet with her window open. Mateo showed up again, this time with both kids. Kevin had brought a coloring book and some crayons for them, just in case. He baked muffins that morning, burned half of them, but no one seemed to mind. They sat, sipped coffee, and talked about life. Not gossip, not politics, just life. What was hard, what was hopeful. Kevin didn't lead anything, he just created the space. People came and went freely. Some stayed for 5 minutes, others lingered. A few just stood by the fence, listening from a distance. But something was happening, something small but unmistakable. A sense of ease, a breath. And in that breath, something long forgotten was beginning to stir again. By the third Sunday, more chairs were needed. Kevin borrowed some from Joyce, grabbed a few milk crates from the side of the garage, and laid out blankets under the tree for the kids. He set up a small table with paper cups, napkins, and a bigger coffee pot. This time, he made a batch of scrambled eggs and warm biscuits. Nothing fancy, just something hot and comforting. When the first guests arrived, the smell was enough to bring a few more wandering in from the sidewalk. Word had started to spread. Quietly, naturally. Not through flyers or announcements, but through whispers passed from porch to porch. A safe space. No pressure, just coffee and conversation in a kind man's backyard. Mrs. Chang came, leaning carefully on her cane, escorted by a boy from the block who always helped carry her groceries. She didn't sit right away. She just stood at the edge, unsure. Kevin noticed and offered her a seat in the shade, no questions asked. She nodded once and settled in. Sylvia brought her clarinet that day. While people talked, she played softly. A familiar tune. Something wistful. Something that reached into the space between words. It didn't interrupt. It carried the silence gently. Darius, the teenager from the corner duplex, showed up late. He stood at the back fence, hoodie pulled over his head, arms crossed. He didn't say anything, but when Kevin offered him a muffin and a nod, he took both and sat near the edge of the group. His headphones stayed in, but his eyes stayed open. It was working, whatever this was. The gatherings weren't organized. There was no theme, no agenda, no leadership. Just presence. People brought whatever they had. Banana bread, folding chairs, old thermoses of tea. The atmosphere was light but honest. Sometimes someone shared something personal, other times it was just weather and TV shows. Kevin rarely spoke about himself. He asked questions and listened. His warmth was gentle, never showy. People responded to that. They felt safe. Mateo's kids started calling it backyard morning. To them, it was the only time their dad didn't look exhausted. He'd laugh, even just a little, while talking to Joyce about how to keep tomato plants alive in the heat. His daughter would color pictures and hand them to Sylvia, who'd smile like she'd been handed priceless artwork. That week, Kevin added another line in his journal. The heart heals in the presence of kindness. Not noise, not applause, just kindness. He kept his notebook close but never visible. He wasn't recording anyone's pain, he was honoring it. With space, with silence, with scrambled eggs and folding chairs beneath a tree. He never said it out loud, but he knew what was happening. This backyard was becoming something sacred. By the fifth Sunday, Kevin stopped needing to set reminders. His body woke up with the sun. Preparing the backyard had become a ritual. Wipe down the chairs, set the table, brew the coffee slowly so the smell drifted to the street, arrange the simple pastries and fruit with care. A bowl of apples, a plate of toast, a folded napkin beside each cup, not because anyone asked for it, but because it made things feel intentional. Joyce started bringing her own teapot and served chamomile to anyone who didn't drink coffee. Mateo brought extra cups. His kids made little signs with colored markers that read "Welcome" and taped them to the fence. Even Mr. Alvarez, who usually kept to himself and worked from his garage, showed up with a small portable radio playing old Spanish ballads. When asked why he came, he simply said, "Because I was invited, and no one invites anymore." That morning, Alicia arrived for the first time. Kevin recognized her right away, the woman with the burgundy cardigan, always walking with her son to the laundromat. She stepped through the gate cautiously, holding the child's hand tightly. Kevin greeted her with the same warmth he gave everyone. "Coffee's hot, food's simple, company's kind," he said. She nodded. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Can I sit near the tree?" "Of course," he replied. "That spot gets the best shade." She settled on a blanket with her son, who clutched a small plastic car and rolled it slowly across the grass. Alicia didn't speak much, but Kevin noticed her shoulders begin to ease as the morning passed. Someone handed her a plate. Sylvia offered to teach the boy a simple song on the clarinet. No one asked questions. No one made her explain anything. That was the unwritten rule. Come as you are. Stay as long as you need. Later that morning, Darius surprised everyone. He pulled out one earbud and offered to help Mateo set up a second folding table. They didn't talk much, but their movements synced with quiet understanding. Afterward, Darius sat on the porch steps and listened while Joyce shared a story about her late husband getting lost on their honeymoon road trip. Everyone laughed, and for the first time, Kevin saw Darius smile. That moment stayed with him. Not because it was big, but because it was real. By the time people began leaving, someone had left behind a small bouquet of wildflowers. Another had tucked $5 under the pastry plate. A child had drawn a picture of the backyard with the words, "My happy place," scrawled in crayon. Kevin sat alone under the tree after the last guest left. The coffee pot was empty. The sun was high, and yet the space felt full. Not with noise, but with life. And that life, in its quiet unfolding, was beginning to change everything. Ken had always believed the most powerful acts of kindness were the ones no one noticed, not because they were small, but because they were sincere. So while the Sunday gatherings brought people together, it was the quiet hours in between that gave Kevin a different kind of purpose. It began with the mailboxes. He had noticed that Hillman's Market sold gift cards near the register. Not flashy cards, just simple ones for groceries, with handwritten barcodes and no branding. Kevin started buying them one at a time, paying in cash. Each week, he'd slip one into a plain envelope and leave it in a neighbor's mailbox. No note, no return address, just the card and a small, folded paper that read, "You're seen, you're not alone." The first time he left one was for Mrs. Chang. He knew her pride wouldn't allow her to ask for help. But when he saw her quietly putting back 2 cans of soup at the store one afternoon, he waited until the next morning to leave the envelope in her mailbox. 2 days later, she walked by his porch with a small smile and a bag of fresh oranges. She never said anything, but he knew. Next was Mateo. Kevin noticed his pantry was always stocked with off-brand cereal and powdered milk. He didn't judge, he understood. When Mateo found the gift card in his mailbox, he knocked on Kevin's door. "You get one of these too?" he asked, holding it up with a puzzled look. Kevin blinked. "What's that?" Mateo laughed. "Guess I'm not the only one." He shrugged and pocketed the card, not questioning it further. But that weekend, Kevin saw him walk out of Hillman's with a smile and a box of real cereal, Fruit Loops, and a carton of fresh milk for his kids. Sometimes the smallest things made the biggest difference. That spirit carried over into the evenings when Kevin walked through the neighborhood and noticed little things others didn't. A fence with broken boards, a bike with a rusted chain, a mailbox on the verge of collapsing. He started bringing his toolbox with him. Never during the day. Always after dark, when the streets were quiet and no one would interrupt. The first fence he fixed belonged to a single mother named Eliza, who lived near the end of the block. Her son, Jacob, rode a battered bike to school every day. Kevin had seen the chain fall off more than once. One night, after walking past the house and hearing the boy crying about not being able to ride anymore, Kevin waited until the lights went out and wheeled the bike quietly into his yard. He cleaned the chain, replaced a missing bolt, tightened the handlebars. The next morning, Jacob stepped outside and let out a loud, excited shout. Eliza came out, confused, and stared at the bike like it had been touched by magic. Kevin watched from his porch, coffee in hand, saying nothing. That same week, Kevin began volunteering at the Eastside Community Center under the name Kevin Reed. It was just a 15-minute drive from Willow Lane, tucked between an old church and a basketball court full of cracks. He had walked in one day, asking if they needed any help with odd jobs. Cleaning, sorting donations, anything. The director, a tired but cheerful woman named Tanya, had looked him over skeptically at first. Then she smiled. "We always need help," she said, "but we don't pay." "I'm not looking for money," he replied, "just looking to be useful." She assigned him to storage, and he spent the next 3 hours sorting canned goods by expiration date and carrying boxes of old books up a flight of stairs that groaned with every step. He didn't complain, he just worked. Quietly, steadily. After a few visits, Tanya started trusting him with more. Kevin never used his real name. He never mentioned acting or films or fame. He just showed up early, stayed late, and helped wherever he was needed. One afternoon, he noticed a teenage girl in the corner of the after-school room, sitting alone at a table with her head buried in a math workbook. She looked frustrated. Her pencil tapped the table like it was counting down to an explosion. Kevin approached carefully. "Need a hand?" he asked. The girl looked up, clearly not expecting anyone to notice her. "It's stupid algebra," she muttered. "I'm failing, and if I don't pass this next exam, I have to repeat the whole class." "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lila." "Well, Lila, I used to be terrible at algebra," Kevin lied with a soft grin. "Then someone showed me the trick to make it less painful." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not a tutor, are you?" "Nope. Just someone who's wrestled with X and Y a few too many times." She slid the notebook toward him. Kevin sat down, careful not to overwhelm her. Within 10 minutes, he had broken the problem into pieces she could follow. After another 10, she was solving one on her own. "How do you explain it like that?" she asked. "I listen first," he said. "Most people just talk." For the next 2 weeks, Lila always asked if Kevin was coming that day. He didn't promise anything, he just kept showing up. and each time she sat a little straighter, spoke a little louder, and solved a few more problems without help. One afternoon, Tanya pulled Kevin aside. "Whatever you're doing with her, keep doing it. That girl never let anyone near her before." Kevin simply nodded. She just needed someone who didn't talk down to her. Word at the center started to spread about the quiet guy with the kind eyes, who helped without needing credit. People didn't ask many questions, they just appreciated what he brought with him. Patience, presence, and the feeling that someone genuinely cared. Back on Willow Lane, Kevin's quiet acts of service continued unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by those they touched. One evening, he passed by the home of an elderly man named Walter, the same man who once told him he noticed how Kevin saw things others didn't. That night, Kevin spotted Walter sitting alone on the porch, coughing into a handkerchief and staring off into the distance. Kevin stopped at the foot of the steps. "You all right, Walter?" The man nodded slowly, but his voice cracked. "Just a cold. Or maybe just old bones catching up to me." Kevin offered to run to the pharmacy, but Walter refused. "Don't trouble yourself. I'll get there tomorrow." The next morning, Walter found a small paper bag hanging from his doorknob. Cough drops, soup cans, and tissues. No note, no signature. Just what he needed. Later that week, a new family moved into a rental unit down the street. A young couple with a baby and tired eyes. Kevin watched as they struggled to carry boxes late into the night. No one else offered to help. Kevin slipped over with a flashlight and 2 strong arms. "I live down the block," he said. "Need a hand?" The father hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that'd be great, thank you." No introductions, no explanations, just kindness passed between strangers. By the end of the night, they had shared a few laughs, a cold soda, and quiet gratitude. The next day, the family left a small plate of cookies on his porch with a note that said, "Thank you, kind neighbor." That's what people started calling him. Not Kevin, not Mr. Reed, just the kind neighbor. The one who showed up when no one asked, the one who waved at everyone, knew when to speak and when to stay silent, and somehow always made people feel like they mattered. He fixed things without fanfare, he gave without receipts, he showed up without being summoned. One night, as he walked home from the community center, Lila ran up to him outside Hillman's Market. "Hey," she said, holding up her test paper. A big red B+ was circled at the top. Kevin smiled. "That's a serious improvement." "First time I've passed anything in math," she said, almost breathless. "My mom cried when she saw it." He nodded, proud but humble. "You did the work. I just helped unlock the door." Lila looked at him for a moment, then said softly, "You're not like anyone else around here." Kevin looked up at the night sky. "Maybe I'm just trying to be who I needed." Once. She didn't ask anything more. She didn't press. She simply smiled and said, "See you next week? I'll be there." And with that, she walked off into the night. Kevin turned the corner toward Willow Lane, where lights glowed softly behind curtains, and lives continued, quietly, beautifully, without knowing just how much one neighbor was holding the edges together. Joyce Donnelly had always trusted her instincts. After decades as a school teacher, she had a sharp eye for detail and an even sharper sense when something, or someone, didn't add up. And lately, something about her neighbor Kevin Reed had started to itch at the edges of her mind. It wasn't anything obvious. He was always kind, always helpful, always present. But that was part of the problem. He was too present, too consistent. The way he listened when people spoke, the way he held eye contact without making anyone uncomfortable, the way he smiled. Just enough, never too much. It felt polished, practiced, like a man who had spent years reading people and learning exactly how to make them feel safe. She tried to ignore it at first. After all, Kevin had been nothing but gracious since he moved in. He brought in her mail when it rained. He helped her fix the leg on her favorite porch chair without being asked. He even remembered her wedding anniversary, which she hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. But the way he did those things, with a calm, deliberate warmth, began to stir something in her memory. It was that smile more than anything. Not the shape of it, but the feeling it gave off. She'd seen it somewhere before. Not in person, but somewhere. A screen, maybe. A magazine. The thought lingered, unspoken. Then came the moment that tipped her curiosity into quiet suspicion. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Joyce had gone to visit her friend Ellen 2 blocks over. On her way home, she passed near the back fence of Kevin's yard and paused when she heard voices. One of the men from the Sunday gatherings, a young father named Desmond, was sitting in one of the folding chairs, shoulders slumped, face in his hands. Joyce didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in Kevin's voice stopped her in her tracks. "I know it hurts," Kevin was saying gently. "Loss doesn't move on our schedule. It clings to the corners of everything. But you don't have to rush through it. Let the sadness breathe. It won't break you. It'll shape you." There was a pause. Then Desmond replied, his voice choked. "You speak like someone who's lost before." "I have," Kevin answered. Enough to know the silence afterward can be worse than the moment itself. But silence is where healing starts. You just have to listen to what it's trying to say. Joyce felt her chest tighten. Those weren't things a freelance writer just said off the cuff. That wasn't casual comfort. That was something deeper, measured, weighted, like someone who had practiced holding people's pain without flinching. She continued walking, slowly, the sound of Kevin's words echoing in her head. That night, she pulled out a small notebook and wrote one line. Who is Kevin Reed, really? The next morning, Joyce found herself standing at her kitchen window with her tea growing cold in her hands. Across the fence, Kevin was watering the small patch of flowers he had planted along his walkway. Nothing exotic, just marigolds and wild daisies. But he moved like someone used to being observed, even when he wasn't. Every motion was graceful, economical, as if performance lived somewhere deep in his muscle memory. She watched for a moment longer, then pulled open the drawer beneath her phone stand. Inside was a dusty folder labeled tech manuals and warranties. But that wasn't what she was looking for. Tucked beneath the clutter was an old magazine she'd kept for a recipe on the back page. She pulled it out and flipped through without much hope, until she froze. There it was, a photo. Not a full cover shot, but a half-page image from a red carpet event years ago. The lighting was dim, but the smile was unmistakable. That same quiet warmth, that same tilt of the head. The man in the photo wore a tuxedo and stood between co-stars, but it was Kevin. Except back then he was called Keanu Reeves. Joyce dropped into her chair, heart racing. The realization hit hard, but strangely, it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like something sacred had just been unwrapped. She closed the magazine and stared out the window again. Kevin, no, Keanu, was now trimming the bush near his mailbox, completely unaware. She didn't rush to confront him. Instead, she started watching more carefully. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. She saw how he lingered after every Sunday gathering to clean up quietly, how he always refilled the coffee pot before anyone could notice it was empty, how he asked questions that made people feel seen without ever making himself the focus. That weekend, she went to Hillman's Market and asked Carmen, the cashier, if she knew anything about Kevin. "Comes in almost every day," Carmen said. "Buys the same things. Coffee, fruit, eggs, always cash, always polite, says please and thank you like it still means something." Joyce smiled at that. "Ever talk to him about where he's from?" Carmen shook her head. "Nope, just figure he's one of those quiet types, like he's running from noise." Joyce nodded. That much was true, and maybe he wasn't running, maybe he was resting. When she returned home, she passed by Kevin's yard. He was repairing a loose fence slat with a power drill and didn't hear her approach. She stood there for a moment, watching him work. Then she spoke gently. "You know," she said, "for a rider, you sure know your way around tools." He looked up, smiling faintly. "Some stories are built, not written." Joyce smiled back, but the seed of truth had already rooted in her mind. She now believed she knew who he was. But she also knew he had chosen this place, these people, for a reason. Joyce didn't tell anyone. Not Sylvia, not Mateo, not even her friend Ellen, who loved to gossip over coffee. She held the suspicion like a delicate egg, too important to break, too fragile to toss around. The truth, if she was right, wasn't just a celebrity hiding behind a fake name. It was a man searching for something he couldn't find in the world that knew him too well. She started testing her theory in small ways. One Sunday morning, while pouring chamomile tea for Alicia, Joyce said offhandedly, "You know, Kevin looks a bit like that actor, what's his name, from those action movies." She watched closely. Elisa furrowed her brow, glanced across the yard at Kevin, then shook her head. "Nah. He's too calm to be that guy." Joyce smiled. That was the point. He was calm, present, real in a way most actors never appeared. And it was working. The disguise wasn't makeup or wigs. It was humility, simplicity. The act of showing up every day without asking for anything in return. But still, she needed more, not for herself, but for understanding. One afternoon, Joyce walked by Kevin's yard and saw a book sitting open on his porch railing. She paused, pretending to adjust her sandal, and glanced down. The book wasn't fiction. It was a worn copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, with handwritten notes in the margins. One passage had been underlined. "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." That night, she remembered how Kevin had spoken to Desmond, how he had comforted that man with words so intimate, so carefully chosen, that they didn't sound like something you learn. They sounded like something you survive. Joyce went home and sat in her kitchen long after the lights had gone out on Willow Lane. She turned over every memory she had of him, the way he gave space in conversation, the way he remembered details no one repeated, the way he never mentioned his past, but asked about everyone else's. And then something else came back to her. Years ago, when she was recovering from surgery, she'd watched a film on TV late one night. A quiet scene near the end had stayed with her. The lead actor sat alone in a hospital hallway, delivering a monologue to a nurse about grief and memory. The voice had been so raw, so still, that she had written the quote down in her journal. She pulled the journal from her shelf and flipped through it. There it was. And now she knew. The words Kevin had spoken to Desmond were nearly identical. The voice wasn't just familiar, it was the same. She closed the journal gently. The mystery was solved, but she wasn't going to confront him. She was going to protect him. The Sunday mornings had started small. Coffee, folding chairs, a few neighbors with tired eyes and open hearts. But Kevin knew the rhythm of growth. He understood that healing, like anything lasting, didn't come with banners or fanfare. It came slowly, through presence and persistence. By the 7th week, the backyard began to shift into something more than a meeting place. Kevin arrived earlier each Sunday to prepare. He cleared the yard of weeds, swept the porch, laid out blankets in the shade for kids who preferred to sit cross-legged while they colored. He brought out a plastic tub filled with sidewalk chalk, picture books, and wooden puzzles. He wasn't trying to entertain children. He was giving them permission to be kids, even if their lives at home didn't always allow it. One Sunday, a boy named Jordan drew a giant mural in chalk along the stone path that ran through Kevin's backyard. It stretched from the porch to the back fence and was filled with stars, a rocket ship, and the words, "I want to fly someday." His mother, Alicia, stood nearby with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching. She didn't speak, but her eyes shimmered. That image stuck with Kevin. It gave him the next idea. He began quietly, reaching out to people he'd met through the community center, using an old email address he had created for privacy. Nothing tied to his name, just a simple signature. K.R. Community Volunteer. He asked if anyone knew a barber who might donate a few hours, a nurse with a license to take blood pressure, a local baker willing to drop off bread. Nothing massive, just small touches of dignity people didn't often receive. The replies trickled in faster than expected. 3 barbers offered to help, rotating Sundays. A woman named Rosa, who worked at a health clinic, agreed to set up a small folding table and do basic screenings. No questions, no insurance forms. One woman emailed back saying, "I've never volunteered before, but if you need someone to bring fruit and clean up afterward, I'm in." Kevin said yes to everyone. He added one new rule: no phones allowed. And it wasn't a strict policy. He didn't shame anyone, but he put up a small sign near the gate that read, "This space is for presence. Let's keep our hands free for handshakes, not scrolling." People respected it. In the weeks that followed, the backyard evolved into something between a sanctuary and a living room. There was a small table with notebooks and pens for people who wanted to write or journal. Teens helped string lights between the trees. Sylvia brought an old speaker and played jazz softly in the background. The atmosphere was calm but alive. Kevin didn't try to lead it. He just nurtured it. He stood back and let it grow. One Sunday afternoon, just after the last cups of coffee had been poured, Kevin walked to the center of the backyard and quietly unfolded a poster board on a small easel. It simply read, "Story Circle. If you've got 5 minutes, we've got time to listen." No one jumped up at first. Most people sat still, unsure of what to make of it. But then Mr. Alvarez, the man who fixed lawnmowers out of his garage, stood slowly, dusted off his jeans, and walked to the front. "My wife used to read poems every Sunday before church," he began. "I never thought I'd miss poems. But here I am." He didn't say much more, just that sentence. Then he sat back down, and for a few seconds no one spoke. Then Mateo added, "My daughter painted a picture of this yard. She told me it's the first place that feels safe." One by one, people began to speak, not long monologues, just fragments. A memory, a moment, a thought they'd never voiced aloud. No one interrupted. No one tried to fix anything. They just listened. That listening changed everything. By the next weekend, teenagers brought notebooks and asked if they could read lyrics or poems. Kevin said yes. He set up a microphone, unplugged just for effect, and an old wooden stool for them to sit on. Sylvia began calling it Open Soul Night. The name stuck. No one judged. Lila read a piece she'd written about her mom working double shifts. Darius, always quiet, surprised everyone with a spoken word poem about feeling invisible. Even Alicia, who rarely said more than a few words, read a single sentence that stopped everyone cold. "I'm still learning how to breathe without apologizing." Someone clapped softly. Then everyone else followed. The backyard, once a forgotten space behind a rental house, had become something sacred. Not because of money or design or power, but because people were free to be whole, even in their brokenness. Joyce noticed the change too. She brought old card tables from her garage and covered them with tablecloths she hadn't used since her husband passed away. "If people are going to share pieces of their lives," she said, "they should have somewhere nice to set their coffee." Kevin thanked her with a smile. She didn't ask questions about who he really was, but every time he sat up early, she was already there, holding a basket of fresh muffins and wiping down the tabletops with care. She watched how people began to linger longer, how the kids started chalking affirmations in bright colors across the fence, how strangers now greeted each other in the street, bonded by what they'd heard or said beneath the oak tree. She knew Kevin had started something more than a Sunday tradition. He had created a space where people didn't have to be impressive. They just had to be real. The transformation didn't stop with stories and songs. With each passing week, more pieces fell into place, as if the backyard itself had been waiting to become something greater. Kevin added a corner for books, secondhand novels, children's stories, poetry collections. A local librarian who heard about the gatherings donated a box full of gently used titles and offered to stop by on Sundays to read to the kids. A small wooden bookshelf appeared near the porch. Painted by Sylvia's nephew, it read, "Take one, leave one," or "Just sit and read." Then came the give table. It started with a few cans of soup and a bag of diapers someone anonymously left one morning. Kevin added toiletries and extra socks. Joyce brought a box of scarves she'd knitted over the winter. No one announced it, but everyone knew. If you needed something, take it. If you had something to give, leave it there. It became a quiet exchange of dignity, free from charity or shame. There was a moment one Sunday when Kevin watched Lila hand a hairbrush to Alicia's son. It was old, but clean. She wrapped it in a small cloth and placed it in the boy's backpack. No one said anything, but Alicia mouthed a soft "thank you" and reached for Lila's hand. For a few seconds, two lives touched through the smallest of offerings. Kevin stepped back and let them have the moment. That was how he wanted it. He never stood at the front. He never gave speeches. He didn't wear anything that suggested leadership. He simply kept showing up, sweeping the patio, refilling the coffee, laughing softly with the kids, and listening when someone needed to talk. People stopped calling it Kevin's house. They'd just called it the backyard. Even those who had never attended began to refer to it like it was part of the town itself. One afternoon, a teenage boy brought his grandmother, who had recently lost her husband. She sat silently for most of the day, then whispered to Kevin on her way out, "This place, it makes me feel human again." That night, Kevin sat under the oak tree long after everyone had left. The lights were still strung between the branches, glowing faintly like stars that had decided to come a little closer. He could hear the wind move through the leaves and the distant sound of children laughing as they walked home down the block. He thought about how a yard of dry grass and old chairs had become something more. Not because of what he gave, but because of what people brought when they were finally given a space to just be. No roles, no reputation, no noise, only presence. And in that presence, healing had quietly begun. It was just after sundown on a breezy Sunday when Travis first wandered into the backyard. No one noticed him at first. He stood near the back fence, head down, hands in the pockets of a weather-worn jacket. His hair was long, streaked with gray, and his beard was untrimmed. But it wasn't just his appearance that made him different. It was the stillness around him, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Kevin spotted him from the porch. Something about the man felt familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. He didn't ask questions. He simply walked over, nodded, and handed Travis a paper cup of warm tea. The man accepted it without a word, gave a small bow of the head, then sat on the edge of the yard, away from the main circle. For 2 weeks, Travis came every Sunday. Always silent, always still. He never ate much, just sat and listened. Sometimes he would stare at the kids chalking shapes on the patio. Other times he would close his eyes when someone played music through the small speaker. But he never spoke, not even once. No one pressured him. The rule of the backyard was simple. Come as you are, stay as long as you need. But Kevin kept watching. That familiar feeling nagged at the back of his mind, like a melody he couldn't place. Then, one night as he cleaned up after the gathering, Joyce approached him and quietly said, "That man, the quiet one near the back. He's been sleeping near the creek behind the library. I passed by him on Tuesday. Didn't ask for a thing. Just nodded at me." Kevin's heart sank. He looked down at the last candle burning on the table. The next morning he went into town and stopped by a dusty old music shop run by a retired jazz pianist named Marvin. The place smelled of rosin, wood polish, and something older. Kevin asked if he had any cellos. "Couple, yeah," Marvin said. "Nothing fancy. Student quality. You buying for someone?" Kevin paused, then said, "Borrowing. Just for a little while." Marvin looked him over and then, without another word, led him to the back and opened a velvet-lined case. The cello was scratched, well used, but intact. Kevin carried it home like it was something sacred. That evening, as the sun dipped below the roofs and the sky turned pink, Kevin waited until most people had gathered. Travis had arrived as usual, standing in his quiet corner. Kevin brought the cello onto the porch and placed it gently on a chair. He said nothing, just let the light hit it in a way that caught every pair of eyes. People turned, curious, and then Travis looked up. His body tensed, eyes locked on the instrument. He took a single step forward, then another. The sound of soft conversation faded into silence as the group watched him slowly cross the grass, his feet dragging like they weren't sure they had the right to move. When he reached the porch, he stared at the cello like it was an old friend he'd lost in another lifetime. Travis's hands hovered over the instrument. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he turned to Kevin with a look that asked the question without words. "Is this really for me?" Kevin gave a single nod and stepped back. Travis lifted the cello slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too fast. He sat down on the edge of the porch and pulled the bow from its case with trembling fingers. For a moment, the air was completely still. The usual background chatter had faded. Even the children stopped drawing. All eyes were on him. He placed the cello between his knees, closed his eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was shaky, rough around the edges, but the second, fuller, rounder, rang through the backyard with unexpected power. Then came the third, then the fourth. A slow melody took shape. It wasn't showy or fast. It was soft, aching, filled with something older than pain and deeper than joy. It was memory, the kind that lives in your ribs long after the words are gone. Joyce closed her eyes and clasped her hands. Mateo leaned forward on his knees. Alicia wiped her cheek with her sleeve. No one spoke. Travis played with closed eyes, letting the bow speak what he could not. The music swelled, dipped, and rose again. His hands, though weathered and stiff, moved with practiced grace. Years of silence were melting through the strings. Every note was a confession. Every phrase, a prayer. Kevin stood near the edge of the porch, watching. Now he remembered. Years ago, before all of this, he had attended a symphony on a rainy November evening. His publicist had dragged him there. He hadn't expected much. But that night, a cellist had played a solo that made him weep in his seat. The man was Travis. And now, here he was, silent for weeks. Unrecognizable to the world, but still carrying that gift inside him. When the last note faded into the air, Travis opened his eyes. They were wet. His shoulders, once hunched and guarded, had softened. He didn't speak. He just lowered the cello gently, stood up, and returned it to the chair. No one applauded. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because clapping would have broken something sacred. Instead, Sylvia walked up and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. Others followed, one by one, each person saying only a few words. Nothing grand, just presence, respect, recognition. That night marked a shift. Something opened in the backyard that hadn't existed before. It wasn't just a place for support anymore. It had become a space for expression, for creativity, for lost dreams to take shape again. The next week, someone brought a battered guitar. A girl read a poem she'd written about growing up without her father. Even Darius, the boy who rarely spoke, asked if he could DJ a playlist he'd made. Beauty was returning. Not perfect, not polished, but real. and that made all the difference. The music had opened something in the community, but Kevin knew not every wound could be reached through art. Some pain lived too deep for chords or applause. Some souls didn't need a stage. They needed stillness, presence, and reminders that they mattered, without being watched. That's when the letters began. They were handwritten, always on the same cream-colored paper, folded neatly with no signature. Each one was a simple message of encouragement, sometimes a single sentence, sometimes a few lines. He left them where they would be quietly found, in mailboxes, slipped under doors, tucked into coat pockets on chilly mornings. To the young mother juggling 2 jobs and 3 children, he wrote, "Your strength is seen even when your exhaustion tries to hide it." To the teenage boy who spent most of his afternoons alone on the basketball court, "The world doesn't always recognize quiet greatness, but it still matters." To Walter, who still walked slowly to the corner store even on the worst days, "You are not forgotten. Your story still ripples in ways you can't see." He didn't expect thank you notes. That wasn't the point. But he began to notice a change. A lighter step here, a warmer smile there, a neighbor who held open the door a little longer than usual. The letters didn't just encourage the person who received them, they began to shift the tone of the whole neighborhood. One morning, Kevin overheard Joyce talking with Sylvia about them. "You get one of those notes?" Joyce asked. "I did," Sylvia said, her voice soft. "It was tucked in my clarinet case," said. "Your music gives people something to come home to." "Who do you think's leaving them?" Joyce asked, though Kevin knew she already had her answer. Sylvia shrugged. "Maybe someone who knows what it feels like to be overlooked." Later that week, Kevin learned that a young family down the block, quiet folks who kept to themselves, had received notice that their rent was about to increase by nearly 30%. Mateo told him about it during cleanup after the Sunday gathering. "They don't have a car," he said, "and the dad just lost his job. If that hike happens, they'll be out." Kevin asked for the landlord's name, then quietly set up a meeting using the alias of a property consultant. He arrived in a plain dress shirt, carrying a manila folder filled with fabricated property data. The landlord, a tired man in his 50s, agreed to meet at a diner off Main Street. Kevin didn't lecture, he didn't posture, he listened. Then he explained the impact of the increase, not just on the family, but on the reputation of the neighborhood. He slid a check across the table, enough to cover the gap in rent for 6 months, and asked that the increase be delayed. No names, no promises, just a quiet gesture in exchange for time. The landlord took the check, nodded. "You don't look like a guy who needs to be doing this." "I'm not," Kevin replied. "But sometimes we do things anyway." The next day, the family received a letter from the landlord. The rent increase had been postponed indefinitely. No explanation, just a line that read, "You've got more time." Kevin stood on his porch that afternoon and watched the father walk his child to school with a slight bounce in his step. No one knew what had happened, but something had lifted. It was a Sunday afternoon like any other. Chairs scattered across the lawn, kids laughing in the corner with chalk and bubbles, music humming low from Sylvia's speaker. Kevin stood near the table, handing out cups of lemonade and asking how everyone's week had been. But then, a sound cut through the warmth. A cry, raw and aching, from the front gate. Every head turned. A woman stood there, clutching something in her hands. Her body trembled. Her face was twisted with grief. It was Elena, a mother who had come to the gatherings only a few times, always quiet, always watchful. She stepped into the yard slowly, like her legs might give out. Kevin moved toward her gently. "Elena?" he said, voice low. She didn't answer. She just sank to her knees on the grass, sobbing. In her hands was a small photograph. Her son, maybe 15, smiling in a school uniform. "Is gone," she whispered. Kevin knelt beside her. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Her body held the answer. Grief so heavy it had nowhere else to go but out through her voice. The others watched from a respectful distance, their faces shadowed with sorrow. Elena clutched the photo against her chest and gasped for air between sobs. Kevin sat with her silently, letting the moment stretch, letting the pain unfold without trying to fix it. Minutes passed. He reached over, placed his hand lightly on hers, and said only one thing: "You're not alone." That was it. No speeches, no comfort wrapped in neat phrases, just presence. The others began to gather. Joyce brought a blanket and gently draped it over Elena's shoulders. Mateo handed Kevin a bottle of water to place beside her. No one rushed her. No one turned away. They simply stood in a quiet circle around her, making space for her grief. Later, as the sun began to dip, Elena sat up straighter. Her face was streaked with tears. She looked around at the group, some familiar, some strangers, and nodded once. "Thank you," she whispered. Kevin walked her to the gate, her arm looped through his. She didn't speak again. But when she left, her shoulders were straighter, her steps more grounded, as if just being seen had restored something that had been falling apart inside her. That evening, Kevin didn't write a letter. He didn't fix anything. He didn't slip money under a door. He sat beneath the oak tree and simply breathed. The kind of breath that comes after deep weeping, not his, but hers. The kind of breath that says, even in this brokenness, there is still humanity to hold. And that was the grace he believed in most. The kind without applause, without credit, without a stage. Joyce Donnelly wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for a recipe. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and bright, with sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. Joyce had a pot of tea steeping and a pie crust half-rolled when she remembered an old Thanksgiving stuffing recipe clipped from a magazine 20 years ago. She went to the hallway closet where she kept everything: cookbooks, newspaper clippings, family albums, and stacks of old magazines that had long since been forgotten. She shuffled through the pile, flipping past wrinkled copies of Better Homes, Time and Sunset Monthly, scanning for the one with a yellow sticky note tucked inside. But halfway through the stack, her fingers paused. On the cover of one curled and faded magazine was a face she knew. Not from television, not from a movie, but from 3 doors down. It was Keanu Reeves, younger, clean-shaven, with longer hair pulled back and that unmistakable stillness in his gaze. The headline read, "The Outsider's Heart, Keanu Reeves on solitude, suffering, and seeking something real." Joy stood in stunned silence, holding the magazine like it was made of glass. Her stomach turned with disbelief. Not because she'd never seen a celebrity before, but because she had known there was something about Kevin Reed that didn't quite fit. His voice, his eyes, the way he listened when people spoke, the way he seemed to carry quiet sorrow like a man who had spent too long in the world, watching and learning, rather than basking in it. She sat at her kitchen table, eyes scanning the cover again and again, flipping through the article inside. It was dated nearly 12 years ago. The words were familiar. She remembered reading it when it first came out. Something about how Keanu preferred silence over press, how he believed kindness should be private, how he used to take the subway even after earning millions. It was all there. She had read it, admired it, then forgotten it. Until now. And now, the words read like a confession. She closed the magazine slowly and looked out the front window toward Kevin's small white house. He was out there, standing on a ladder, trimming tree branches. His posture was steady, his movements careful, a man who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Joyce's breath caught in her throat. Kevin Reed was Keanu Reeves. She didn't rush over. She didn't even reach for the phone. She made her tea, finished her pie crust, and let the truth settle in her chest, like the final piece of a long-forgotten puzzle falling into place. By sunset, she knew what she had to do. That evening, after the Sunday gathering had ended and the backyard lights were dimmed, Joyce waited until the last of the guests waved goodbye. Children had drawn chalk rainbows on the sidewalk. Mateo had helped put away the folding chairs. The energy was soft and satisfied, as if something unspoken had been fulfilled. Joyce stepped into Kevin's backyard carrying the magazine in a paper bag. He was rinsing mugs at a folding table. His sleeves were rolled up and his hair was tied loosely behind his head. He looked peaceful, maybe even relieved, as if this had become his version of church. Joyce walked up slowly and said nothing at first. She watched him for a moment, then reached into the bag and handed him the magazine. He looked at it, then looked at her. There was no panic in his face, no attempt to deny it. He exhaled quietly and gave a small, weary smile. "I wondered how long it would take someone," he said. Joyce held his gaze. "You didn't make it easy." "I didn't want to be found," he replied. She nodded slowly and gestured to the picnic bench beneath the elm tree. They sat side by side. The air was cool, and the sound of a wind chime drifted in from the neighbor's porch. "I have one question," Joyce said. "Just one. Why here?" Keanu looked at his hands, rough and stained from weeks of manual work. Then he looked up at the quiet homes that lined Willow Lane. "Because no one expects anything from Kevin Reed," he said. "So I can finally give everything away with no one watching." Joyce stared at him for a long time, her heart full and breaking at the same time. "You've given more than you know. You brought this place back to life." "I didn't do anything special," he said softly. "I just listened." She shook her head. "You showed people how to show up again, and you did it without asking for anything in return." He looked at her, eyes shimmering. "That's all I ever wanted, just to matter quietly." Joyce reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a tiny photograph. It was worn at the edges, a picture of her late husband George taken decades ago on a fishing trip. She handed it to Keanu. "George used to say, 'The best men are invisible until they're needed.' I think you're one of them." Keanu's lips tightened as he accepted the photo, his thumb brushing the faded image. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more than you know." She smiled and stood slowly. "Your secret's safe with me, Kevin. But I think you should know, hiding who you are didn't make you invisible. It just made you real." He nodded, still seated, watching her walk away. The magazine lay closed on the bench beside him, forgotten in the moment. As the stars blinked on above Willow Lane, Keanu stayed in the backyard alone, the silence no longer a burden, but a shelter. For the first time in years, he felt seen for who he was. Not a symbol, not a story, just a man with a rake and a folding chair, trying to be of use. And somewhere deep in the quiet of that night, Grace took a seat beside him. Keanu understood something most people didn't. Some of the deepest struggles were hidden behind polite smiles, behind shut doors and overgrown yards. Not everyone had the words to ask for help. Not everyone knew they deserved it. And so he turned his quiet attention to those who had been made to feel invisible. He began visiting the local elementary school, just a few blocks from his rented home. At first, he sat quietly in the back of PTA meetings, listening more than speaking. He offered to fix the squeaky library cart. Then he donated a new one, anonymously. He met the school nurse and asked what they needed most. She laughed, thinking he was joking, until she realized he meant it. The next week, a delivery truck brought cartons of backpacks filled with school supplies. Markers, binders, healthy snacks, even toothbrushes. The delivery slip listed the donor as YL Supply Cooperative. No one knew who that was, but the nurse did. She glanced out the window and saw Keanu, carrying bags of mulch to the school garden, dressed in old jeans and a flannel shirt. At the local community health clinic, he quietly dropped off care packages, soap, feminine products, socks, vitamins, baby wipes. He used the name of a made-up business again, KR Logistics. The receptionist asked no questions, just smiled and nodded. He started asking around discreetly. What happens to people who don't have an ID? Or who don't speak enough English to fill out a job application? Who helps the families who live 6 to a room and still can't afford rent? He met Alejandra, a nurse at the clinic who also ran a small volunteer network for undocumented immigrants. She was fierce, overworked, and exhausted from years of being told her efforts didn't matter. Keanu asked to meet with her in private. "I'm not trying to be seen," he told her, "but I can help, not with speeches, with tools." Alejandra didn't recognize him. She just saw a quiet man who listened more than he talked, and who came with envelopes full of prepaid cell phones and cash for bus fares. He paid to translate flyers into Spanish, Vietnamese, and Tagalog. He helped fund a small legal clinic inside an old bakery that had closed down. There, volunteers helped people apply for state IDs, food assistance, and employment documentation. It wasn't loud work, but it mattered. Keanu started keeping a notebook tucked beneath his mattress. It wasn't filled with movie lines or reflections on fame. It was a list, a long, handwritten record of names and needs. He tracked people he'd met and what might help them live with a little more ease. There was Rosa, a widowed grandmother caring for 3 grandkids who couldn't read the bus schedule. He paid a local teen to walk them to school each day and gently helped Rosa apply for paratransit services. There was Darius, a soft-spoken man with a stutter who couldn't keep a job because interviews rattled him. Keanu sat with him and did mock interviews at the community center every Wednesday, helping him build confidence one question at a time. He never revealed who he was, never hinted at wealth. In fact, he made a point of dressing plainly, using prepaid phones, and never speaking in past tense about his life. To them, he was simply Kevin Reed, the man with kind eyes and calloused hands, who never asked for thanks. But behind the scenes, he was weaving something larger. He began organizing weekend workshops, free resume clinics, basic computer literacy sessions, translation assistance, and even a quiet clothes closet set up in the basement of the old Baptist church. All of it was coordinated through anonymous donations and burner email accounts. Joyce helped manage one of the Gmail accounts, forwarding requests and helping schedule appointments for those too shy to speak up themselves. What touched Keanu most were the small victories. A man named Orlando, who had once served time, got a job stocking shelves at a local grocery store. A young woman named Alane, once terrified to leave her house without her older brother, walked into the DMV alone for the first time and left with an ID in her hand. Still, Keanu knew this couldn't last forever, so he began quietly mentoring. He met weekly with a group of 5 trusted neighbors: Joyce, Alejandra, Mateo, Lila, and a new volunteer named Reina, a high school counselor who had grown up nearby. He called them the Torch Crew. Each Sunday they'd gather under the elm tree in his backyard with notebooks, printouts, and coffee. He taught them how to handle paperwork, how to navigate bureaucracy, how to listen without pity and offer help without pride. He made them promise something important. "When I leave," he said one night, "you keep this going. Not in my name, in yours." They nodded. No one asked when he'd go. No one wanted to believe he ever would. One night, a storm rolled through the neighborhood. Power went out. Keanu lit candles in his small kitchen and opened the door for anyone who needed warmth. 8 people showed up, including a toddler wrapped in a blanket. He made grilled cheese sandwiches on a gas stove and told them stories, not about acting or fame, but about a boy who once biked to school through snow and a friend who taught him what real courage looked like. They didn't need to know those were memories from movie sets or moments tangled with loss. They only needed to feel safe. When the power returned and the rain cleared, he stood in his yard looking at the rows of houses, some lit up, others still dark. He realized something then. Helping the invisible wasn't about making them seen. It was about making them feel they belonged, even when no one was looking. A week later, Joyce found a small envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a folded letter and a hand-drawn map of the support network they had built. No name, no signature, just one sentence at the bottom in Keanu's handwriting. People shine brightest when they're no longer afraid to be small. And from that day on, Kevin Reed's name never needed to be spoken again. His legacy was no longer tied to a face or a career. It was written in chalk on sidewalks, in job applications, in bandaged knees and repaired fences. It was alive in them. The first time Sophie appeared in the backyard, she didn't say a word. She just stood quietly near the folding chairs with a sketch pad tucked under one arm and a juice box in the other. Her jeans were 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a shoelace, and her shoes looked like they had weathered more than one rainy season. Keanu noticed her immediately, not just because she was small and quiet, but because she looked around the space like she'd been searching for it her whole life. Joyce brought her over gently. "This is Sophie," she said. "She's new around here." Sophie gave a quick nod, barely meeting Keanu's eyes, and sat down cross-legged near the chalk bucket. She didn't draw with the others. She didn't talk. She just watched. For 2 weeks straight, she returned every Sunday like clockwork. Still no words, still no drawings, just presence. Then, one morning, as Keanu was placing banana bread slices onto paper plates, he felt a small tug on his shirt. Sophie stood there, eyes bright, lips pressed into a question. "You're famous, aren't you?" she asked softly. "But you're sad." Keanu froze. It wasn't the question that shook him. It was the clarity, the honesty in her tone, the lack of fear or performance. Just a child, seeing what others didn't dare say. He bent down, looked her in the eye, and gave a quiet smile. "Maybe," he replied, "but being sad doesn't mean I stopped caring." She didn't push for more. She just nodded, walked to the corner of the yard, and finally opened her sketch pad. That day she drew a picture of a tree with no leaves, but its roots stretched deep and wide across the page. It was detailed, almost haunting, and Keanu felt something shift inside him. Sophie reminded him of his daughter, the one he'd lost, the one whose name he rarely spoke aloud. And yet, here was this little girl, tugging on something buried so deep he hadn't even realized it could still ache. He began saving a plate of food for her each Sunday, quietly tutoring her with math worksheets when no one was watching, bringing coloring pencils, just a few each time, so she'd have something new. She opened up slowly, not with stories or memories, but with questions. Why the sky turned pink sometimes, how birds knew where to fly, whether people could be good and lonely at the same time. Keanu never rushed her answers. He just listened, and in doing so, began healing something in himself, too. It was Joyce who gently pulled Keanu aside one afternoon, concern lining her voice. "She and her mom," she said, glancing toward the sidewalk where Sophie had just skipped out of the yard. "They're sleeping in their car. I asked if they needed anything. Her mother just said, 'We're okay, we move a lot.' But that girl, she's holding too much for someone her age." Keanu had noticed the way Sophie sometimes flinched at sudden noises, how her mother always stood behind the gatherings instead of joining. Her name was Mara, early 30s, quiet, with the tired eyes of someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep in years. She never asked for help, never took more than a single paper plate of food, and she always left before the sun dipped below the rooftops. That night, Keanu couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling fan in his rented bedroom, the soft whirring of its blades doing nothing to quiet his thoughts. He remembered the hospital room where he once held his daughter's hand, how small it felt, how weightless. He remembered thinking there was no justice in the world when children suffered while grown men walked away from everything they broke. And now, Sophie, this sharp, fragile, curious girl, was sleeping upright in a cold car seat while her mother guarded her like a soldier. The next morning, Keanu brewed 2 thermoses of tea and walked to the community center where Mara volunteered once a week helping sort clothing donations. She looked surprised when he appeared, unsure whether to smile or brace herself. He held out one of the thermoses. "It's chamomile," he said gently. "Not much of a peace treaty, but maybe something warm." Mara took it with trembling hands. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied, "but I'm not here to fix anything, just listen." She sat down beside a pile of gently used coats, and for the first time, she spoke without looking over her shoulder. "We left when Sophie was 6, she said. "Her father, well, you can probably guess. We've been bouncing around ever since. I work where I can. We shower at the gym. She thinks it's all an adventure. But I see her watching other kids. I see her pretending." Keanu nodded. "Kids know more than we think." "Yeah," Mara whispered. "She knew the first time we slept in the car. She pretended she wanted to camp, just so I wouldn't feel ashamed." Keanu didn't push. He didn't ask her to accept help. But the next day, he paid 3 months' rent on a small studio above a retired mechanic's garage and left the key taped inside Sophie's sketchbook, tucked between 2 pages. Mara never asked who did it, but she cried for 10 minutes straight in Joyce's arms before taking her daughter to their new home. From then on, Sophie became a fixture, not just in the backyard, but in Keanu's heart. She began drawing every week, pictures of neighbors, of trees with blossoms, of stick figure families holding hands beside houses that didn't have wheels. And Keanu, still Kevin to them, began to carry her questions with him, even after she left for the night. "Do you think stars ever get tired?" she asked one evening while they watched the dusk settle across the rooftops. "Maybe," he said, "but they don't stop shining." She smiled. "I don't think you stopped either. You just got quieter." That sentence stuck with him. Sophie didn't know his past, but somehow she understood his present in ways most adults never could. She didn't need to know about his movies or the pain he carried. She only needed to feel safe enough to ask questions that mattered. On Sunday, she brought him a drawing. It was a picture of a man kneeling beside a child, helping her plant a tiny tree. Beneath it, she'd written 3 words in bright green marker: "You showed up." He framed that picture and hung it in the kitchen of his small rental house, not because it was about him, but because it reminded him what mattered. Sophie's presence, her honesty, her fragile strength. She became the pulse of everything he was trying to build on Willow Lane. In a world full of people shouting to be seen, she had whispered the truth he most needed to hear. And because of her, he realized his mission wasn't to disappear. It was to show up, fully, quietly, humbly, exactly where he was needed. It started with a storm. The winds rolled in late at night, rattling window panes and knocking over trash bins along Willow Lane. Thick clouds blanketed the moon, and the smell of electricity hung in the air like a warning. Keanu had just finished reading one of Sophie's short poems, left folded on his doorstep, when the first crack of thunder split the sky. He stood in his living room, lights flickering above, listening to the wind howl. Then came the sharp pop, faint but unmistakable. He knew that sound. It wasn't thunder. It was glass shattering. A second later, his phone buzzed. Joyce's voice trembled through the speaker. "It's Mateo's house. Something's wrong. I see smoke." Keanu didn't hesitate. He was out the door and sprinting down the block before he even realized he hadn't put on shoes. The rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. By the time he reached Mateo's small blue house, the smell of burning oil had thickened in the air, pouring from an open kitchen window. The front door was ajar. Inside, chaos. Mateo's oldest daughter, Camila, age 9, was crouched by the stairwell, frozen in place, eyes wide with fear. Her little brother, Leo, no older than 5, was crying near the couch. No one else was in sight. Keanu rushed in. "Ah, come on, sweetheart," he said to Camila, guiding her gently toward the door. "We're going outside now." She grabbed his hand with surprising strength, clinging to him as if she already knew he wasn't just a neighbor. He lifted Leo into his arms and hustled both children out the door and down the wet steps. Mateo appeared moments later, shirt soaked, eyes wild. He had been in the backyard, cleaning out the gutters, unaware that a forgotten pan on the stove had ignited. "Camila! Leo!" Mateo dropped to his knees, embracing them both, his voice cracked with relief. "Oh my God, are you okay?" Keanu nodded, stepping back to let the father take over. He turned toward the house. Flames had started to spread along the kitchen wall, but the fire department was already on its way. He could hear sirens cutting through the storm. Neighbors spilled into the street in robes and slippers, umbrellas barely holding up against the downpour. Someone shouted for blankets. Someone else called for Mateo's wife. The community, always fractured, was suddenly together. Keanu stood at the edge of it all, shirt drenched, face streaked with soot. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply nodded once at Mateo, turned, and walked away. He didn't want thanks, and he definitely didn't want a camera. But someone, standing behind the hedges across the street, had already taken the photo. A blurry silhouette in the rain. A man in a hoodie, holding a crying child. It hit social media the next morning. The photo didn't look like much at first glance. Just a grainy image of a man in a hoodie, face barely visible through the curtain of rain, carrying a child out of a burning house. But someone zoomed in. Someone circled the man's jawline, his posture, the curve of his hand on the boy's back. And someone asked the question that couldn't be unasked. Is this Keanu Reeves? Within hours, the image went viral on local neighborhood pages. By morning, it was circulating on national fan forums. Speculation erupted. Some dismissed it as a look-alike. Others were convinced. The shape of his mouth, the kindness in his eyes, the fact that he vanished before first responders arrived. Just like something Keanu would do. But no confirmation came, no press release, no statement from any representative. Keanu had disappeared long before the first flashing lights pulled up to Willow Lane. He'd slipped down a side alley, returned to his house, and quietly cleaned the soot from his arms. He tossed the burned hoodie in the trash. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't check the news. Instead, he lit a single candle and sat by the window, listening to the distant sirens fade, letting the silence tell him what mattered. That night rattled the entire neighborhood. Mateo, normally a proud, private man, walked door to door the next day thanking everyone who had helped. When he reached Kevin's porch, he paused, hat in hand, eyes full of something deeper than gratitude. "I don't know how you got there so fast," Mateo said softly, "but I saw what you did. My kids, they wouldn't be here if not for you." Keanu smiled faintly and said, "You'd have done the same." Mateo nodded. "I would have tried, but I might not have made it in time." There was no handshake, no grand gesture, just two fathers, standing under a morning sky, both carrying something heavier than they let on. The following week, more strangers showed up at the Sunday backyard gathering. People who had heard about the fire. People who wanted to thank someone, anyone, for what had happened. They didn't know who Kevin was, but they heard stories. That he helped, that he listened, that he fixed things when no one was looking. Whispers began to stir among the neighbors. Joyce tried her best to shield him, redirecting questions, brushing off curiosities. But even she could feel the tide turning. The mystery of Kevin Reed had begun to crumble. Still, Keanu carried on as if nothing had changed. He laid out folding chairs, brewed the coffee, smiled at Sophie when she tugged on his sleeve and asked if she could read her newest poem. He listened as Travis played a haunting cello melody in the corner, now fully back in his own skin. He nodded along as a woman stood and shared her story of surviving addiction, thanking whoever had left the anonymous letter on her doorstep, encouraging her to try rehab again. Keanu didn't flinch, he didn't shrink. He simply kept showing up. But inside, he felt the shift. The gift of invisibility, so rare, so sacred, was starting to fray. He had come here to vanish. But somehow, by giving without credit, he had made himself more visible than ever. He knew the fire would leave a mark, not just on Mateo's walls, but on the rhythm of the neighborhood. Something had ignited, not destruction, but unity, courage, compassion. And once a fire like that catches, it spreads fast. He wondered, not for the first time, how long he could stay, and what it might mean to finally be seen. It started with one blurry photo on a local blog, then it hit a national tabloid. By midweek, satellite vans rolled onto Willow Lane. Strangers with microphones and cameras stood on the sidewalk, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who'd pulled 2 children from a fire and vanished into the night. They weren't looking for Kevin Reed anymore. They were hunting for Keanu Reeves. Neighbors were stunned, some skeptical, others quietly proud. But the mood quickly shifted from curiosity to discomfort as reporters began knocking on doors, offering money for quotes, digging through recycling bins, pointing long lenses through backyard fences. Joyce Donnelly answered one knock with a firm voice and a firm grip on her cane. The young reporter barely got a word out before Joyce cut her off. "Helm came here for peace," she said. "You don't get to take that from him." She closed the door without another word. Keanu, watching from the edge of his living room window, knew it was over. The quiet was gone. He spent that night pacing, then sitting, then standing again. The next morning, he walked to the old diner 2 blocks away and paid the waitress double for a tray of pastries. He stopped by the community center and arranged folding chairs. Then he returned home and swept the backyard. Sunday came fast. It was cloudy with the scent of early spring and fresh soil in the air. Neighbors arrived slowly at first, unsure if they still could, if the magic of it all was broken. But then Sophie showed up with a drawing in her hand and asked where her seat was. Joyce arrived next, bringing 2 new faces from the retirement complex. Mateo, with his arm still in a sling, helped set up the last few chairs. By noon, there were over 50 people in the backyard. Keanu stood by the porch steps, watching them settle. Children played with chalk. The cello case sat untouched in the corner, waiting. Conversation swirled, but the air was different this time, thicker with expectation. People knew, or at least suspected. Joyce gave him a small nod. Keanu stepped forward. He looked out at the faces. So many he'd come to know not by headlines or scripts, but by bread shared, fences mended, tears wiped away. He breathed in slowly and let the moment arrive before speaking. "Hi," he said softly. "I guess it's time I introduced myself properly." The backyard fell silent. "I'm Keanu Reeves," he said, "but here, I've been Kevin. And that name, that quiet, gave me something I didn't know I was missing." He paused. "I didn't come here to hide," he continued. "I came here to heal." Keanu glanced toward the weathered fence at the edge of the yard, where Sophie now sat cross-legged beside the chalk murals. Her tiny drawing was still in her lap, but her eyes were locked on him. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in. The kind of silence that filled the yard wasn't nervous, it was reverent. "I've lived most of my life being watched," he said. "Every word, every step, every mistake, scrutinized, exaggerated, judged. And after a while, that kind of spotlight blinds you to everything else." He let the words hang for a moment, then continued. "I came to Willow Lane because I wanted to know what it felt like to just be a person again. Not an actor, not a symbol. Just someone who could walk to the store, sit in the sun, listen to people talk about their day without being asked for a photo. And what I found here." His voice cracked and he looked down briefly. "What I found here was more real than anything I've had in a long time. There were no cameras now, just eyes. warm eyes, familiar ones. I saw families struggling and still loving each other through it. I saw teenagers showing up for math tutoring even when they were tired. I saw meals shared between people who barely knew each other. And I saw grace, quiet grace, the kind that doesn't make headlines. He looked over at Joyce. I never meant to deceive anyone, but I needed to learn how to give without being praised for it, to help without it becoming a story. And this neighborhood, this backyard, you gave me that. Joyce's eyes brimmed with tears, but she smiled and gave a single nod. I know my presence here now brings attention, Keanu said, and that attention might not be good. For some of you, it might mean people show up who don't care about our community, who just want a picture or a scandal. So before that happens, before I leave, I wanted to say thank you. Sophie stood up. She held out her drawing and walked it over to him. Keanu knelt to receive it. It was a picture of the backyard, colored with soft crayons. People smiling, pastries on the table, the cello in the corner, and a big sun overhead. At the bottom, in crooked letters, it said, "Kevin made the street happy." He looked at it for a long time, and then at her. "Thank you, Sophie," he whispered. He stood again and turned to everyone. "I'll be stepping away after today," he said gently. "But the work, the love, doesn't stop. It never was about me. It was about us." Mateo raised his coffee cup in a silent salute. Lila, the teen he'd tutored in algebra, wiped her eyes. A few neighbors began clapping, but it wasn't thunderous. It was soft, sustained, respectful. A recognition, not a celebration. Keanu took a final look at the space. The chalk art, the mismatched chairs, the empty coffee cups, the people who had become, in some small but powerful way, his second family. Then he walked inside to begin packing. The next morning, a handwritten sign sat taped to the gate. This space was started in silence. Let's keep its spirit alive. Sunday mornings, all welcome. And beneath it, in smaller script, Rafe doesn't need a stage. By Monday morning, the little house on Willow Lane sat quiet again. No movement, no laughter drifting from the backyard. The folding chairs were stacked neatly beneath a tarp. The chalk art had begun to fade beneath light rain. Keanu was gone, but the gate didn't stay closed for long. That following Sunday, Joyce opened it. She didn't say much, just swept the backyard, wiped down the table, and set out a tin of oatmeal cookies. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, but she didn't pause. A few neighbors passed by and slowed down, curious. Some kept walking. Others peeked through the fence, uncertain whether they should enter now that Kevin wasn't there to welcome them. It was Mateo who stepped up next. He arrived with 2 bags of groceries, his youngest son riding on his hip, and the older one trailing behind with a tray of paper cups. Without a word, he unpacked bread, peanut butter, apples, and poured orange juice into cups. Then he looked at Joyce. "You did a good thing opening this gate," he said. "Let's keep it going." Joyce blinked away the tears and nodded. By 10:30, there were 10 people in the backyard. By 11, 20. Some sat in silence. Some caught up with neighbors. Children started drawing again on the concrete. Someone played a battered guitar. The spirit hadn't left with Keanu. It had simply passed into new hands. Mateo began checking in with people during the week, quietly making sure that those who had relied on Kevin's anonymous help still had what they needed. He spoke with the school principal and arranged for Lila to continue receiving tutoring from a retired teacher Joyce knew. He helped Sophie's mom apply for housing support, using some of the resources Kevin had quietly assembled. Joyce, meanwhile, turned the front room of her home into a tiny lending library. She used old shelves and a rolling cart to hold books donated from neighbors, schools, even a local bookstore that heard about the backyard story. Kids wandered in after school, some just to sit and read, others to help alphabetize titles. No one claimed to lead the gatherings. That was the beauty of it. One week it was Sophie's mom organizing a hot lunch. The next it was Lila who brought art supplies for the kids. The Sunday mornings became more than tradition. They became sacred in the quietest, most ordinary way. Even without Keanu, or Kevin as they'd known him, the neighborhood kept becoming something better, stronger. The kind of place where people paused to talk, where they didn't just ask how you were, but waited for the real answer. And every now and then, someone new would walk through the gate. A man in a rumpled jacket who'd been sleeping in his car, a single mother carrying her toddler, an elderly woman looking for conversation. Each one found a seat, a plate, a smile, and slowly they too became part of the rhythm. The gate never locked again. In time, the story of Kevin spread, not through headlines or tabloids, but through the people who had felt his kindness. Those who'd seen him fix a broken fence under the cover of night. Those who'd shared coffee with him at the table in the backyard. Those who remembered the way he listened, without judgment or distraction. They never used his real name, they never needed to. To them, he wasn't a celebrity. He was the man who showed up. And somehow, his presence lingered. One afternoon, Lila found a letter tucked into her math workbook. It wasn't signed, but she recognized the handwriting. It said, "You already have everything you need to become who you dream of. Just keep going." She clutched it to her chest and didn't tell anyone for weeks. She didn't have to. The message had already taken root. Joyce started writing her own notes. At first, she doubted whether her words would matter. But she remembered Kevin's example, how a few lines on paper could hold more comfort than 1,000 empty gestures. So she left little cards at the library table, scribbled with reminders. "You are enough. Your story matters. We're glad you came." People began to respond in kind. A man who'd never spoken much brought a box of tools and offered free repairs. A teenage girl set up a corner where people could write their prayers, hopes, or worries and leave them anonymously. One by one, the neighborhood stitched itself together. The change didn't come all at once. There were still struggles. People still lost jobs, faced evictions, battled grief. But now, they weren't alone. On the first anniversary of Kevin's arrival, a small wooden sign was placed by the gate. It read, "The table is open." Beneath it, a hand-painted mural showed an empty chair, a steaming mug, and the words, "Grace doesn't wear a name tag." They never knew if Keanu saw it, but some suspected he might have. Once, Mateo found an envelope in his mailbox. No return address. Inside was a $10,000 0-cents check, made out to a local charity he'd just started with Joyce. A sticky note was attached with 3 words, "For the next meal." He didn't say a word, he just smiled and put it in the drawer. The neighborhood, once marked by silence and struggle, now hummed with quiet purpose. Every corner held a story. A boy who rode his fixed-up bike to deliver books to seniors. A mother who taught Spanish to kids after school. A former addict who built garden beds for vegetables behind the community center. What Keanu had started wasn't just a project, it was a philosophy. A movement without a face, where no one chased applause. Where healing came through presence, not performance. And every Sunday, someone new found their way to that backyard. They didn't come looking for answers. They came because someone had told them, "You should visit the house with the open gate." And they did. And in that small space, among folding chairs and mismatched mugs, they rediscovered something they didn't know they'd lost. Hope, forgiveness, and the stunning realization that sometimes the most incredible legacies are left not by those who stay, but by those who quietly leave something behind. Dear Daniel, I've been meaning to write this letter for some time now. Maybe it's the quiet this morning. Maybe it's the sound of the wind moving through the trees the way it used to on Sundays in the backyard. Or maybe it's just time. I told you the story of a man named Kevin Reed. You wouldn't know him by that name, The world knew him by another. But around here, on our little patch of Willow Lane, Kevin was just Kevin. A man with kind eyes. A man who wore second-hand boots and carried groceries for strangers. A man who listened more than he spoke. The first time I saw him, I thought he looked out of place. Too calm, too centered. It wasn't just his manners or the way he always had time. It was something deeper, something I couldn't put my finger on. He reminded me of someone who had once carried great weight and had laid it down. Not because it got lighter, but because he simply couldn't carry it anymore. At first, I didn't ask questions, I just watched. I watched him help Mrs. Chang with her groceries. I watched him wave to Lila as she biked past. I watched him mow the lawn of the abandoned house on the corner. Always early in the morning, always without a word. He brought people together without asking anything in return. That backyard of his, folding chairs, mismatched cups, leftover pastries, it became something sacred. No one said it out loud, but we all knew. We were different because of him. He never said he was lonely. He never said he was grieving. But I could see it, Daniel. In the way he smiled when the children sang. In the way he paused before answering a question, as if measuring every word for kindness. In the way he lingered by the door, not wanting to be the first to leave. And then one day, you know what he did? He saved Mateo's children from a house fire. Ran in without thinking. The news came like thunder after a quiet storm. Reporters started sniffing around, the neighborhood buzzed, and then I saw it. His face on an old magazine cover, tucked between dusty cookbooks I hadn't touched in years. It was him. And when I asked him why here, why this life, he simply said, because no one expects anything from Kevin Reed. So I can finally give everything away with no one watching. Employee, I don't know if I've ever heard anything more honest. He left not long after, but he didn't really leave. His presence, Daniel, it's still here. In the lending library I keep by my window. In the stories we tell at Sunday coffee. In the quiet way Mateo opens the backyard gate and waits, just in case someone new needs a place to sit. It's strange how one person, just one, can shift the course of so many lives without needing credit. Kevin didn't ask for applause. He didn't post photos or speeches. He never once told us who he was. He let us figure it out, in our own time and in our own way. You would have liked him, Daniel. He reminded me of your grandfather in some ways. Gentle, curious, always with something kind to say even when words were hard to find. I think you would have talked about books or the stars or why people cry when they're happy. He would have listened, not to fix anything, just to hold space for your thoughts. That's what he gave us. Space. Room to grow, room to mourn, room to laugh again after hard years. He didn't lecture or lead. He just showed up, with a pie, with a rake, with a cello for a man who'd forgotten how to hope. And it changed everything. Sophie still talks about him sometimes. Her drawings are pinned to the bulletin board in the rec center. Bright swirls, gentle faces, and a note under one sketch that simply says, Kevin's hands made quiet things better. She's only 10 now, but she saw what most adults miss. That real strength is quiet. Real kindness doesn't ask for attention. Her mom's found work now, and a home. She helps with Sunday meals. The gatherings are smaller now, but they continue. Some people bring casseroles, others bring nothing but time. Mateo leads most of it, and sometimes he gets choked up during the closing circle. We all understand. I kept one of Kevin's letters, just a short note he slipped into my mailbox one evening after I lost a close friend. It said, "Grief doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've loved deeply. Don't rush the healing. Just breathe and let others sit with you in the dark until morning comes." That letter sits by my bed now. It reminds me to be patient with others, with myself. You're probably wondering what happened to him. We don't know for sure. One day he was just gone. Like he arrived, quietly. No goodbye, no warning. But not one of us feels abandoned. We feel trusted. He left us with the tools, with the example, and that was enough. I've told you before that the world doesn't always reward the soft-hearted, but sometimes it remembers them. Not with fame, not with statues, but with habits passed from one person to another. Joy passed along like a favorite book, grace passed down like a family recipe, hope handed from neighbor to neighbor like a warm coat on a cold day. That's the legacy Kevin left us. And now I'm passing it to you. You're young, Daniel, but the world needs more people like him. People who ask nothing and offer everything. People who see others not for what they lack, but for what they carry. People who understand that being present is sometimes the greatest gift. I hope you remember this when life gets noisy, when success is measured in followers or dollars or trophies. I hope you remember the man who wore a hoodie and fixed bikes and never needed the spotlight to feel whole. Kevin Reed taught us that kindness doesn't need cameras, applause, or awards. It just needs a willing heart. So, my sweet boy, if you ever wonder what to do in a world that feels too big, too broken, or too loud, do what Kevin did. Open your backyard, make some coffee, and pull out a few folding chairs. With all my love, Grandma Joyce. Have you ever seen grace in an unexpected place? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. And if this incredible story touched you, consider subscribing to the channel, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we need most.